The Batman is the 8th standalone theatrically released live-action Batman movie, and like every other one of those movies, except for one of them, it gave us multiple takes on the villains of Batman's immense rogues gallery. Although technically all these villains have been done before in live action, the ones that are in the Batman, they have arguably never been done this well, and these are probably the new quintessential takes on these villains. With that in mind, in this video, I'll be doing an updated live-action Batman villains ranking. The last time I did this was 5 years ago, complete with the villains of the Batman. I should note that I will not be including any non-Batman movie, even if it does feature Batman or a Batman villain. So no Justice League, no Suicide Squad, no The Suicide Squad, and no Joker. Plus, I won't be including Dawn of Justice either, even though it does have Batman in the title. It's not a standalone Batman movie. Oh, also, Catwoman from the Batman won't be counted because unlike the other Catwomen, she was never antagonistic. From the start till the end, she was on Batman's side. If I were to count her, then she'd be higher than the other two Catwomen because she's a great modern interpretation of a more heroic Catwoman, which is my preferred version of the character. So I won't be counting her, but I did really like her, just to let you know. With that in mind, let's begin with this video. This video will be in a ranking, but also in a tier list format. In general, you could ignore the tiers, but I just wanted to do a cutoff point between each tier just because I felt like it. It's my video, I could do what I want. Starting with the F tier, we basically have all of the Schumacher villains from Batman Forever and Batman Returns. The exact ranking starts with Bane being the worst. I mean, talk about completely and utterly not understanding a character. In the comics, Bane is a strategic mastermind who's the mental and physical equal, or even surpasses, Batman, and the one to finally beat him in the Nightfall storyline. And in this movie, Bane is a dumb, mute brute who's literally just a henchman for Poison Ivy. This version of Bane is easily the worst live-action Batman villain, and all the other villains from this movie and Batman Forever are just awful. Tommy Lee Jones's Two-Face and Jim Carrey's Riddler both find themselves right above Bane in the F tier. If I had to choose which one I like least, it's gotta be Two-Face, just because Riddler is more expected to be silly, plus Jim Carrey is better at it than Tommy Lee Jones. But both of them are basically tied for second to last place. They're just the goofiest sons of bitches you could ever think of. Two-Face was basically made into the Joker, but significantly more annoying. He has nothing in common with Two-Face other than his design, which is awful, and the fact that he has a coin that he flips. Meanwhile, the Riddler is just like Jim Carrey if he was 10 times as energetic as he usually is, basically Jim Carrey on overdrive, and they were just both the most annoying Batman villains ever. Poison Ivy technically has some good things going for her. Her design isn't awful, and the accurate, seductive nature that she has, some of it works, but much like the rest of the movie, she's way too cartoony to take seriously. I mean, the way she acts and the way she talks, none of it feels real. It all feels like a cartoon. This goes for Mr. Freeze as well. He's still in the F tier because of course he is. I mean, the ice puns alone should make you question your own reality, but he's higher than the rest just because Arnold at least seems to know what he's doing and he's having fun with it. Plus, they included the Nora story, which is always effective, or almost always effective. Still, knowing those things aren't enough to put him in a higher tier, he still is super cartoony, and it's the focal point of what people talk about when talking about this movie, the ice puns. It's insane that they thought they could get away with that. Every 2 minutes is a damn ice pun. It's insane. The only villain in the D tier is Danny DeVito's The Penguin from Batman Returns. Now, I know this version has his fans, and I gotta say, I absolutely love Danny DeVito in It's Always Sunny, but I really don't like this Penguin. I think they took the penguin part of him way too literally, making him an actual human, like half human, half penguin, with penguin-like hands. He eats just a whole fish in the middle of the movie. Aside from that, he's also extremely horny for no reason throughout the entire movie. And I don't know, I just found this penguin to be absolutely disgusting. I mean, they did accomplish what they were going for, making him disgusting, but it was a bad idea in the first place, and it makes me not ever want to see Batman Returns again, despite having some good elements to it. Moving on to the C tier, we have Carmine Falcone from Batman Begins. Falcone is a pretty generic, super powerful mob boss type character, but I thought he was used in a pretty smart way in the beginning of the movie, as he is initially the biggest threat to Bruce, but then he's reduced to basically nothing after a single encounter with the Scarecrow, which effectively portrays Gotham's transition to a more, let's say, colorful group of criminals. But that isn't enough to put him any higher than the C tier, because other than that, he was, like I said, a very generic mob boss character, which is not the type of thing that I like for the most part in villains. The generic mob boss without anything else aside from being a mob boss, I'm not really a fan of that, but I used him well in one aspect. Talia al Ghul is also in the C tier. I did like her motivation and how it connected to Batman Begins, but I didn't love the actress in the role. She was sidelined for most of the movie as well, and her death scene is arguably the worst scene in the trilogy. I think the general idea was good of her getting revenge on the main hero for killing her father, Ra's al Ghul, which is why when they reused that exact same concept in Arrow Season 5, it worked pretty well. Here, though, it isn't executed to perfection, and Talia al Ghul is one of the weaker villains of that trilogy. Starting off the B tier is Anne Hathaway's Catwoman, who is really only a villain for like half of the movie before becoming a slightly better character as a more heroic Catwoman on Batman's side. But before that, she's a pretty good portrayal of Catwoman. Honestly, I don't really know what to say here. She's just a pretty good portrayal. I don't really have any big thoughts on the character. I don't dislike her, which is why she's not any lower, but out of the three main live-action Catwomans from the last 30 years, I think she is my least favorite. Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman is certainly less comic accurate than Anne Hathaway's or Zoe Kravitz's, as, like the Penguin, they take her cat side of the character way too literally. But I think that it works way better here because unlike the Penguin, she doesn't become a disgusting character. She is still like that sexy cat burglar character that she is for the most part. Her chemistry with Batman is also pretty great, and she has some pretty cool action scenes, including the scene where she whips the heads off of a bunch of mannequins, which apparently Michelle Pfeiffer actually did, and she did on the first take, which is really impressive. And on top of all that, I think that she has a really cool costume, maybe the best live-action costume for Catwoman still, because since then they've done these more realistic takes on the costume, the less comic booky takes, and I think I like this one the most still. Jack Nicholson's Joker is, I think, a relatively good portrayal of the character, especially for all the way back in 1989. It's definitely a good first theatrically released live-action portrayal of the character. Like, he's got a good design, and he's got that Joker energy, but I do think that in today's standards, he wouldn't really be considered one of the greatest. He is in the B tier, which is pretty good, but for the Joker, one of the Batman's greatest enemy, I think the B tier is a bit low. I think this Joker doesn't really have a good enough rivalry with Batman to be any higher, despite being, a fun villain who does at some times remind me of the animated series Joker. I think there's something missing, which is why he's not any higher than the B tier, and lower than some other villains who don't really come close to being as good as the Joker can be. Finally, we get to a new villain. At the top of the B tier is the Batman's version of the Penguin, who's arguably the best live-action version of the Penguin we've gotten. Now, I don't think that means as much for the Penguin as it does for, like, the Joker or Riddler, because I'm not a huge fan of him in really anything, like comics, cartoons, TV shows, movies, games. Honestly, I think that he's the weakest of the most popular Batman villains, and I don't mean in strength, I mean in just being an effective villain. Still though, I do think this version of the Penguin was pretty good. The makeup effects were incredible, making Colin Farrell absolutely unrecognizable, and Penguin brought some much needed levity to an otherwise mostly humorless movie. He was the main source of comedy in this movie, which is something, but he wasn't exactly menacing enough or had a good enough rivalry with the Batman, and it was fine. The interactions between him and the Batman were pretty good, but none of it were good enough to put him any higher than the B tier. That being said, I don't think any version of the Penguin, unless they drastically change the character, could be any higher than the top of the B tier, because like I said, he's not exactly a good villain anywhere. Right at the bottom of the A tier is Ra's al Ghul. I really don't like that pronunciation. I much prefer Ra's, but that's what he's called in the movie, so let's go with it. Ra's was used, I think, very effectively as this person who trained Bruce, but then became his enemy. They were going for a different, more modern update on Batman's origin story, and I think that the way they put Ra's into it worked really well. Ra's also had some of the best dialogue of the trilogy, and Liam Neeson did a fantastic job in the role. I do think a character like Ra's or Ra's needs much better fight scenes than the trilogy had to be a truly definitive version of the character, which is partially why he's not any higher the A tier or why he can never be anywhere close to the S tier. but I do think that he was still a very, very effective villain. Maybe they should have cast a Middle Eastern character in the role, but I do think that for the time, he was a pretty great Ra's or Ra's al Ghul. Far higher up than I ever could have imagined is Carmine Falcone from The Batman, who you'd think would be just a generic mob boss like the one from Batman Begins, but the fact that he directly connected to not only the main conflict of the movie, but also the main reveals of the movie, specifically the ones to do with Bruce and his parents, but also the core emotional moments of Batman and Catwoman's arcs, which made him one of the most central characters of the movie and an effective force behind what makes this movie work. The actor also did a pretty good job at making you hate him. He was a very hateable villain, especially in his scenes with Selina, but also in his scenes with Bruce. The fact that he's this high up, higher than most of the more iconic and on paper much more interesting villains, while just being a regular human with no specific characteristics about him to make him a comic book character, he's just a mob boss. I think that's pretty impressive that he's as effective as he is in the movie, and he's in the A tier. In general, Scarecrow was probably my second favorite villain in Batman's Rogues Gallery, and I think that this movie pulls him off rather well in a slightly more realistic take on the character. There are scenes where he's genuinely scary, and I think Cillian Murphy is a fantastic actor who does a great job portraying this obsessed but also determined person. When unmasked, that is, but when he's masked, he's this scary psychopath. Also, I just love how he says, like, the Batman when in their first meeting, like, he's excited in this clip right here.
He's here. Who? The Batman.
I just love that. Right at the top of the A tier is Bane from The Dark Knight Rises. Now, my opinion on Bane and the movie have changed over time. I used to like both a lot less. And look, he's obviously not perfect, and I do see, like, the same criticisms that I had back then. They just don't bother me as much anymore. It is hard to understand him sometimes, and he's not nearly as big as a definitive Bane should be, nor is he Latino. But all that being said, Bane is still a fantastic villain in this movie. He has some of the best dialogue in the trilogy. You don't have to look much further than the Born in the Darkness monologue for that. He definitely can be truly scary and physically menacing at times, and his rivalry with Batman definitely feels real, more so than most villains on this list. Had he been more accurate, or even bigger, he would have been in the S tier, but being at the top of the A tier is obviously no small feat either. This brings us to the S tier, starting with Two-Face from The Dark Knight, which is a villain that I don't think people talk about nearly enough when talking about The Dark Knight, probably because he is vastly overshadowed by the Joker. It's a shame because The Dark Knight gave us not just one, but two of the best live-action Batman villains of all time. And Two-Face is one of them. He is in the S tier, and he could have been the main villain in this movie, and I think the movie would have still been fantastic. First of all, his design is incredible. The CGI of his face looks gross and kind of awesome at the same time. Probably the best Two-Face design in anything ever. Harvey's transition into Two-Face was handled so effectively, and the way it connected to Joker's plan and the general one bad day philosophy, how it showed a truly good man going crazy after losing everything and becoming Two-Face. This works so much better because it's not like we were just told he's a good man. We actually saw it for like 2/3 of the movie. For the most part in this movie, he wasn't Two-Face, he was Harvey Dent. It was just in the last act that he was Two-Face. Aaron Eckhart did a truly incredible job in the movie, both as Harvey Dent and as Two-Face, pulling off some of the best dialogue in the trilogy, including probably my favorite line in the entire trilogy: "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain," and also some of the most intense scenes in the movie, including the climax with Jim Gordon's family. I do think that his acting is not praised nearly enough because, again, it's overshadowed by Heath Ledger's Joker, but still, I think that he's an S tier Batman movie villain, and it should be talked about more. Then we have the newest main villain, the Riddler, played by Paul Dano from The Batman. This is certainly a very different take on the character, but one that doesn't ignore the key aspects of the character, including his riddling ways. In fact, it truly embraces it much more than Batman Forever ever did, while also making him easily the scariest, most intimidating, and most brutal version of the character we've seen on screen before. The interactions between the Riddler and Batman were definitely few and far between, but in the limited interactions that they did have, including this one really long scene, I think the Riddler cemented himself as one of the best live-action Batman villains ever, and one of the best Batman and main villain rivalry scenes, but just rivalries in general. Paul Dano did an incredible job portraying this psychopath in some of the most intense moments in Batman history. Truly a fantastic villain, and I'm glad that they finally did a really good, fantastic live-action Riddler, because Riddler is one of my favorite Batman villains, and I was really excited for this. And finally, of course, it's predictable, number 1 is Heath Ledger's Joker. There's nothing I can really say about The Dark Knight's Joker that hasn't already been said a million times. I mean, Heath Ledger does an incredible performance as Batman's, and quite possibly comic book's greatest villain. The rivalry between Joker and Batman is as good here as it is in, say, the DC animated universe or the Arkham games with Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill. Joker can range from scary to funny to philosophical to truly deranged depending on the scene, all of which is done to perfection, and all of which is the cornerstone of Joker, giving us one of the best comic book movie villains of all time, quite possibly the very best. That's it for this video. That's it for the ranking for all of the live-action Batman villains. Let me know who your favorite or least favorite, or if you want to even give me the entire ranking of all, I think it's 19 live-action Batman villains. If you want to include Catwoman from the Batman, then that's 20. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want to, support me on Patreon like Sadiquddin does. Love you, man. You're awesome. And thanks for watching. Goodbye.